All right, welcome back to part two of building communicative competence. Another thing that someone mentioned in the mid-course evaluation was that sometimes they get nervous going into our breakout groups or our small groups because they don't know what to expect, and so they're uncomfortable contributing. So I wanted to let you know that on Monday when we have class, that we will be going over these scenarios, and that you are going to identify the form, the content, and the function. So if you want to, go ahead and look over those in advance so you are prepared for our small group work on Monday. All right, this is some information I'm going to share. Just going to go over it quickly in case you were to hear it in or to see it in an educational report related to communication. And so there are different terms that you may hear when you are looking at or reading a report. The first term is primitive communication. When we think about the intentionality of primitive communication, this is really pre-speech communication that we have to interpret what the intent of it. So a person is engaging in some type of communication and we assign intentionality to it. So we're shaping that intentional communication. And so an example that we often think of is that when we have an infant and the infant starts saying, mama, 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 then the mother says, oh my gosh, he said mama. And they get all excited and they're providing tons and tons of reinforcement for that behavior. And they are shaping that behavior in their response. Okay, so we're shaping that intentional communication. Next, we have conventional communication. These are also pre-speech acts, but this is when the student is actually trying to use some form of communication, such as eye gaze, looking in the direction, reaching for something, and they're using that communication to influence the behavior of someone else. And so this is often a primary mode of communication for some of our students, but specifically it is for everyone early in life. And so again, there is intentionality to the communication, and what you are trying to do is trying to influence or affect the behavior of someone else. The final term that I'm going to share with you is referential, and this is really intentional communication. It can be through speech, it can be through an AAC device, and again, with this, it could be when we're looking at an AAC device, it could be pictures, words, it could be manual signs, it could be aided or unaided communication systems. And so when you think about primitive communication, it's really when you're trying to respond to what someone is saying and you're trying to shape that intentionality. When we think about conventional communication, this is when the student is trying to really use speech as a function to get something fulfilled, to affect the behavior of someone else. And then that referential is just the act of communicating something to another person. And so again, those are terms that you might find in an educational report. So we mentioned pre-intentional or non-intentional communication. So how do we shape that? How do we shape non-intentional communication to make it intentional? And somebody asked me to give examples in the mid-course evaluation of UDL during class. So here's an example. And this is multiple means of representation. So we might have a toddler who is crying. So for example, this is a student who is non-vocal and the toddler is starting to cry. They're communicating something, but right now we don't know what they're communicating. Are you hungry? Are you tired? Do you need your diaper changed? Do you want me to pick you up? And since I don't know, I'm going to start to shape intentional communication. So what I'm going to do is that as the toddler is crying, I'm going to reach out my hands. And oftentimes what a toddler will do or a person will do is that when you reach out your hand, they will reach up their hand. So you can see I'm starting to shape that, and then I'm going to immediately pick that child up to reinforce that reaching for a hand. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to fade that and until the child, instead of crying, just reaches up to let me know that they want to be picked up. And so the minute they reach up their hand, I'm going to shape that by picking them up and then providing them with positive reinforcement. So again, they're going to go from crying to me shaping that behavior by reaching out my hands. Then I'm going to reinforce them reaching their hand, even though it's paired with crying, and then fade that until in the end they are engaging in the desired behavior, which the desired behavior of communication is to reach up their hand and then to be picked up. So, how do we shape a child's eye gaze for intentional communication? So, this is going to be number 4 in your participation document. And this is what I want you to think about. This is a student. The student really, really, really loves the Barbie. That is what the student wants. The student prefers the Barbie. We've done a preference assessment. That's what they love. What they do not want is they do not want the car. They don't want a Matchbox car. So, how could you shape that child's eye gaze for intentional communication? And in this case, the communication would be, I want the Barbie. So again, loves the Barbie, does not like the car. So go ahead and stop your video and respond to that, and then we'll discuss it in class on Monday. All right, welcome back. Let's keep going. Next, we're going to talk about expressive and receptive communication. So this is something I want you to stop again, and this is just a quick write. I want you to write, what do you remember or know about expressive versus receptive communication? What are they defined of? What's the difference between them? So go ahead and stop your video, come back, and then I'll share the definitions, and you can compare them to what you wrote. All right, so what is expressive communication or expressive language? Well, it's how we communicate. It's how we communicate things like our thoughts, our feelings, our idea, our knowledge, our wants and needs. And we can express that. That's where expressive language comes from. We can express that through speaking, through writing, through using gestures. Excuse me, I apologize that. We can express it through the use of an AAC device. So if a student was using spoken language, what would that look like? It would look like the student saying, I want to go outside when they want to go outdoors to play, or I want to go to play outside. That is them expressing. That's what we're used to. That's normal for us. What would that look like for a student who's using an AAC device? Well, it might look like them selecting a cell on their, or a symbol on their AAC device for I want pizza or I like pizza. So those are very easy for us to see and understand. And we often, if we're going to plan for communication, we often plan for expressive communication. But we don't want to forget receptive communication or receptive language. And what is that? It's how we understand and process the language that we hear or read. Because remember, writing is expressive language, reading is receptive language. So it can be listening, it can be reading, it can be comprehending information, but all of this is how we receive information and we process it. So what might that look like for spoken language? Well, if we say to a student, please pick up the toy and put it in the box, and the student follows those instructions. They received that information that was communicated, that was expressed to them. They processed it, understood it, and then responded to it. What about with an AAC device? Well, if I were to say, what animal do you see? And the student chose the cat, that is a demonstration that they receptively understood what was requested of them. They processed that language, they understood, and then they responded to it. So what this demonstrates is that you have a sender and a receiver. You could think of that as a speaker and a listener, or you could think of it as a writer and a reader. All three of those are the same types of, one is expressive, one is receptive. And so you have the sender or the speaker who shares, communicates a message. The listener or the receiver receives that language, and processes that language, and then they give feedback. It could be engaging in conversation, it could be responding, it could be giving the speaker something that they requested. But what you must remember is these are not always equal. A student's expressive and receptive language are not always equal. For example, we have a student in our class right now, one of your peers, and in his class, he has a student with a very specific syndrome. And when I looked up the characteristics of it, because I kept seeing it in his Canvas submissions, one of the characteristics is that the students or individuals with this syndrome often have higher receptive language than they have expressive language. And that is really important to know, because that means that that student understands more than they are able to express, or may, based on the characteristics of that syndrome. And so we don't ever want to underestimate what a student understands and comprehends, and we never want to equate that with what they're able to express. You can also have it the opposite way. I always find it really interesting I had a preschooler with Prader-Willi syndrome, and his expressive language was amazing. His receptive language, not as strong. He could express way more than he could understand, he could receive. So, again, remember, those are not always equal. So, number six, here's question number six for your participation grade. How do you figure out how a student communicates? How do you figure that out? So, I want you to stop your video, write down your response, and then come back to me. All right, so let's check and see. Here's some ways that I have determined that you can figure out how a student can communicate, how a student communicates. And one way to do that is to interview their family and their caregivers. Siblings are great people to speak with. If you want to know someone who knows how an individual with complex support needs responds or communicates, ask their sibling. They know. Not only that, you can do direct observation. You can observe the student for a specific amount of time and see how are they communicating? How are they communicating their knowledge? How are they requesting things? How are they demonstrating what they know or want? And you can do structure probes. So let's look over here to the left. Here's an example. It's called of an inventory that you might use. And this is called the Direct Observation Form for Non-Symbolic Forms and Functions. And this is by Weatherly from 2006. So you can look this up if you would like to access this. And it is a keeper. This is something I would encourage you to keep. So when we have students who are at that non-symbolic level, we want to look at things like how do they request help? Does their muscle tone tense? Does it relax? Do they become upset? Do they start vocalizing or do they get quiet? How do they protest things? Do they start to engage in self-stimulatory behavior? Do they become aggressive? Do they reach for materials that they want? So with this direct observation form for non-symbolic forms and functions, you can look at things like the instrumental functions, the social functions, the sensory functions. And this is a great way to figure out how do students who are at that non-symbolic level or that non-intentional level even, how do they communicate with the world around them? So let's look at an individual. This is a student with complex communication needs, and this goes really fast. So I need you to pay attention, okay? Because it's going to be 10 seconds of really quick. And what the mom says is time to go to bed. That's important to know. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the student's communication. We're going to determine the form, the content, and the function. And in this case, you're just going to stop and think. And then we're going to look at the direct observation form and see if we can look and determine how he is communicating with his mother. All right, remember, it's super fast. Here we go. Time to go to bed. Let's go. All right. Told you it was really fast. So stop really quickly and you stop the video to think about, you don't have to write anything down. What was the form of his communication? What was the content and what was the function of his communication? All right. So when we look at the form of his communication, it could have been several things. He vocalized. He had movement, body movement. He pulled back, for example. He put his hand out, so he was gesturing. What was the content? What was he trying to communicate? He was communicating no. His mama told him it was time to go to bed, and that was an absolute, very definitive communication of no. And then what was the function? He was protesting. He did not want to go to bed, and that's what he was communicating. Now, again, this is an individual who many people would look at and say, oh my gosh, look, he has such challenging behavior. He refuses to do anything. When in reality, that is likely the not possibly the only way he knows to communicate what his wants and needs were in that instance, but it was definitely what has been effective at some point because he is continuing to engage in those communicative behaviors. And so when we look at the direct observation form and we go down here to protest, we saw that his muscle tone began to tense. He changed his facial expression. He started vocalizing. He started gesturing not towards the materials, but towards his mama as if saying no. He was withdrawing and pulling back. He became upset. He did not become aggressive, thank goodness. But as you can see that using this form, we could then determine how is the student communicating. And this is something that, again, you could also, give to a parent or to a caregiver and and have them completed, especially for students who are new and for whom you were not aware, you don't know their current communication systems. There's also something called the Communicative Competence Inventory, and really the purpose of this, and this you do have access to, there's a link here on the PowerPoint, is it identifies any kind of challenges or barriers that prevent the student from becoming a competent communicator. And not only that, another really cool thing it does is it gives you possible solutions so that when you're working, this is something you would use with your team, with your speech therapist, occupational therapist, parents, everybody that's involved in serving the student, to do some collaborative problem solving. And when you're using the Communicative Competence Inventory, you're looking at four different groups of communicators. First, you're looking at the student as an active communicator. You're looking at peers as competent communication partners. And when you're teaching communication, you have to make sure that our students have communication partners. Sometimes it's you, sometimes it's your para. Whenever possible, make sure it's a peer because those are highly engaging communication opportunities for our students. But then you also want to look at the families as involved collaborators. And then we also want to reflect on ourselves and to see, are we as educators effective facilitators? So what might this look like? So when we're looking at the student as an active communicator, we want to look at things like, does the student use a range of multimodal communication, such as gestures, pictures, devices, effectively? If the answer is yes, you're going to keep working through the inventory. If the answer is no, then you'll see here it gives you a possible solution. You can model and reinforce use of different communication modes to see which one the student began to engage in. When you're looking at a peer as a communication partner and seeing if they are competent, one of the things you want to determine is, do students perceive the student as someone who can contribute to conversations? Because there are people who don't believe some of our students, especially those with complex communication needs, are competent communicators and can contribute to a conversation. If the students do believe that, you keep moving, and if they don't, then you increase class-wide disability awareness and you have your student with complex support needs use the AAC in the presence of a class so the students can see that the student is a competent communicator. Here is the Chung and Douglas article. The link is in our PowerPoint if you would like to get that. This is a keeper. I keep telling you when things are really good, this is a keeper, especially if you're working with new students, if you're working with young students, if you're working with students for whom you're not aware of their communication abilities, or you're doing something like starting a peer mentor program. So when you're looking at families, you want to know, does the family perceive AAC as essential and beneficial? Are they using it at home as well as at school? If they are, keep on rolling. If they're not, you're going to educate the family on the benefits of AA systems and how important generalization is. So I need the student to be using it at home, in the community, and at school. And then you want to make sure you're involving those parents in decision making. So again, I'll let you look over this inventory. It is a great tool when assessing your student and when planning for your students' communication needs and instruction. All right, for number 7, now that we've talked about, and I suggest that you stop and look back over the inventory. You can either use the link that's in the PowerPoint or you can stop the video and read through it real quickly. Were there any terms, this is number 7 for your participation, were there terms that you didn't recognize? Were there questions you hadn't thought about before? How might you use this in your teaching, and do you think this is a valuable resource? And so for those, you can just label those A, B, C, and D, but if you do and you don't include the sentences or the questions, please make sure you start your sentences with, I didn't recognize the following terms, or questions I hadn't thought about were, okay? So go ahead and stop your video, answer those 4 questions, and then come on back and join me. All right, now that you are back, I'm just going to quickly go over this. This is, again, just in case you were to see it in an educational report. It's not anything that you're going to be tested on for this class, though. There are 4 areas of communicative competence, and in order for our students to be really effective communicators, they need to have some level of proficiency in each of these areas. So the first area is linguistics, and that's really the elements of the spoken word or use of the AAC device. Do you know the symbols? Can you form a sentence? It's things like syntax and semantics. So those are the linguistic skills students have. Next, we have the social skills related to language, and these are those rules that we all follow. And it's things like taking turns in conversations, not interrupting one another, not monopolizing the conversation with topics only of your interest. And if you think about it, that's a lot of times how our students get excluded. They get stuck on their conversation. They never ask a question. They never allow anybody else to contribute their own interest to the conversation. There's also operational area of competence, such as if you use an AAC device, are you able to turn it on and turn it off? If you are using a response board, can you access the response board? Remember, if we take an AAC device and we stick it on the teacher's desk, we are taking away a student's voice. So again, we don't want anybody to take our voice away. Don't take our students away. Make sure they have access to, and that would be part of the operational skills they would need for communication and competence. And then finally, there is a strategic component so that when a conversation falls apart or has a breakdown, somebody doesn't understand what you're trying to communicate to them, can you repair that conversation? Can you then add something to your communication that is going to support their understanding, such as taking their hand as you're talking and walking them to the item that you want? Or can you say what you were trying to express in a different way? So again, these are 4 areas of communicative competence, and they're things we want to make sure we're planning for. All right, that's the end of part 2. How are you doing? You got it? I need to, spend a little more time on it, or I'm completely lost. Questions are always, always welcome, so make sure that you write them down in your discussion guide down at the bottom. Down at the bottom is fine with me. I'll look for them anywhere in your discussion guide so that I can make sure that I address them on Monday. All right, I'll see you in the next video.